Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about some pretty interesting topics. The first one being lateral inhibition, and the second one being Bayesian predictive coding. Now I do have a small Susan Shore device effects update, which I will be including later on in the video. Now first of all, let's talk about lateral inhibition, the role of cartwheel and vertical cells, and we're also going to talk about hyperactivity versus hypersynchrony. Now, obviously, precision in auditory processing is extremely important, and you can watch my video on how the fusiform cells process sound to understand a little bit more about it. But in general, the auditory system needs to parse extremely detailed information about incoming sound waves, like pitch, loudness, timing, etc., etc. For example, distinguishing a 2000 Hz tone from a 2200 Hz tone in a noisy environment requires very precise tuning and very detailed or meticulous filtering of the neural signals. And this precision not only helps identify different speech sounds and music notes, but also to localize sounds in space as well. Of course, we all know about the cochlear nuclei, which are the first major brainstem centers to receive input from the auditory nerve. And if you all remember, two functionally distinct subdivisions, the dorsal cochlear nucleus and the ventral cochlear nucleus, and they, in parallel, perform the processing tasks that contribute to a complex auditory experience, so to speak. Generally speaking, lateral inhibition is when active neurons suppress the activity of neighboring neurons tuned to similar frequencies, and this preserves frequency selectivity and makes sure that when one band of frequencies activates a particular channel, the adjacent channels are dampened or pushed down. And without lateral inhibition, the auditory system would produce blurred frequency boundaries. Now, although fusiform cells in the dorsal cochlear nucleus and also certain principal cells in the ventral cochlear nucleus carry the main excitatory output to higher regions like the inferior colliculus, etc., etc., they are not direct sources of lateral inhibition. Instead, the inhibitory interneurons, especially the cartwheel cells and vertical cells in the DCN, are super duper important for providing these inhibitory side branches. Now, as I've explained in my 5HT video, cartwheel cells provide very strong inhibitory input, primarily glycinergic or GABAergic, onto fusiform cells, and sometimes onto other interneurons. And their firing can reduce the overall excitability of fusiform cells in specific frequency bands, basically shaping how signals are passed upwards the auditory pathway. Now, vertical cells, which are also another class of interneurons in the DCN, they project more broadly within the nucleus overall, and they contribute to lateral inhibitory side loops that help distinguish frequency boundaries. Now, the cells I mentioned, the cartwheel and vertical cells, are predominantly found in the dorsal cochlear nucleus. In the ventral cochlear nucleus, which is actually considered to be very crucial in hyperacusis or loudness hyperacusis, and there's different inhibitory interneurons that play different roles. But the principle remains very similar. Local interneurons shape the output of principal excitatory cells like Bushy cells in the ventral cochlear nucleus to maintain crisp frequency representation. Now, I'm not going to explain the functionality of the DCN and the VCN specifically, but generally speaking, really quick, the dorsal cochlear nucleus is the multimodal integration hub of the auditory pathway, and the DCN is known mostly as the source of the central noise after peripheral or cochlear damage, and is generally considered to be the the strongest link to tinnitus generation. And the VCN, the ventral cochlear nucleus, is more directly implicated in loudness hyperacusis, according to Susan Shore's research, where the cells, the bushy cells, for example, become hyperactive. For those who forgot, bushy cells in particular help encode sound intensity and timing. Now, when a person experiences acoustic trauma or hearing loss, the reduced input can weaken inhibitory circuits in the dorsal cochlear nucleus, or just upstream in general, the midbrain as well. And when this lateral inhibition is compromised, excitatory drive dominates. And fusiform cells, for example, ramp up their spontaneous firing rates due to the dysfunction of, for example, Cartwheel cells. Spontaneous firing rates are also known as hyperactivity. And this phenomenon, of course, can contribute very significantly to tinnitus, or the elevated baseline or the elevated noise in the auditory pathway that reinforced by cofactors like inflammation or somatosensory issues, because the DCN inputs multiple somatosensory signals as well, can eventually elevate the noise, quote unquote, enough to a point where the thalamus, for example, would not filter it properly, and the brain will interpret this noise as sound. Now, while hearing loss is considered by some to be absolutely necessary as a precursor to tinnitus, of course, we all know that not everybody with hearing loss has tinnitus. And this is, of course, because the thalamus actually does its job and filters this noise in the auditory pathway as not important or aberrant signals that should not reach the auditory cortex and, of course, be perceived as noise. Now, people who have a messed up thalamus, or, for example, top-down projections, as I mentioned in my previous video, this is absolutely possible due to a person having visual snow-induced tinnitus, which is possible, or due to very heavy drug use, for example. These top-down projections can also actually disbalance the excitatory and inhibitory balance in the dorsal cochlear nucleus as well, leading to increased spontaneous firing rates. Now, about hearing loss being a necessary precursor, I think that it is very plausible that this is true. Due to the disruptions of inhibitory and excitatory balance, as I mentioned before. And pretty much everybody has hearing loss. I don't think there's a single person who does not. And also, as we all know, the higher frequencies go first, as they say, especially in people with age-induced hearing loss. And this correlation could potentially be the reason why a lot of people experience tinnitus at higher frequencies. Now, this is quite a controversial topic, but I am more inclined currently to believe that hearing loss does seem to be a necessary precursor, not a cause, not a direct cause, but a necessary precursor to excitatory and inhibitory disbalance, potentially leading to persistent hyperactivity in the dorsal cochlear nucleus. Now, as I mentioned in my previous videos, this maladaptive plasticity that occurs due to any type of damage like excitotoxicity, 5-HT disbalance, or serotonin neurotransmitter disbalance, for example, or somatosensory issues like aberrant signals from the somatosensory pathways. All of this stuff, all of these cofactors are actually what drive this aberrant noise to a level where the thalamic gating mechanism is unsuccessful, and this noise, or this aberrant noise, is perceived as sound. In other words, people with hearing loss definitely do not experience tinnitus all the time, but the more cofactors that you have, it can actually sensitize, if not drive, this hyperactivity to a point where the thalamus or the thalamical gating mechanisms would not sufficiently filter it before it is reached in the auditory cortex and perceived. The question you're all probably thinking about is, will fixing hearing loss fix tinnitus? In most cases, I don't think so. No, it will not. Now, the reason why I believe this is the maladaptive plasticity that occurs due to hearing loss being a precursor to increased neural noise in the auditory pathway. This maladaptive plasticity cannot be fixed exclusively by recovering hearing. Now, once this maladaptive plasticity occurs and this hypersynchrony occurs, and also the hyperactivity or spontaneous firing rates of the fusiform cells are increased to a point where the brain perceives it as tinnitus, recovering hearing in itself will most likely not be enough to quote-unquote reset these circuits to their default functionality. Now, there's an interesting topic about cochlear implants and cochlear stimulation suppressing tinnitus. Now, I will be making a video on this later, but this has to do with the regulation of inhibitory circuits in the dorsal cochlear nucleus, ergo the cartwheel or vertical cells. There was an amazing paper published recently, which I will be making a video about cochlear stimulation and what actually happens in the dorsal cochlear nucleus with cochlear stimulation, but that's for later. Now, when there is aberrant signaling, and temporary disruption of excitatory and inhibitory balance due to something like impacted earwax, or due to something like, for example, an acoustic neuroma, once this irritator is removed, the excitatory inhibitory balance usually recovers and the person's tinnitus usually goes down. But that is different from maladaptive plasticity due to cofactors. Now, there is a difference between central noise and central gain. Central noise being the elevation in random spontaneous firing or hyperactivity, and central gain being a homeostatic plasticity mechanism that enhances the brain's overall sensitivity. We were talking mostly about central noise. Central gain is a little bit more complex, but in tinnitus and hyperacusis, I guess it does have a role to play, but we're going to talk more about that later because that's an entirely different topic. Now, moving on to hyperactivity versus hypersynchrony and their differences. Now, hyperactivity is when individual neurons fire more frequently than normal, even in silence. And hypersynchrony is when clusters of neurons fire together in time, sometimes also known as bursting or oscillatory episodes. In other words, hyperactivity is the raw material or lots of random noise signals, but hypersynchrony is the quote-unquote organizational principle that binds scattered firing into a coherent and more robust signal, which is more likely to be sent upwards and recognized as a meaningful event. For example, let's say we have one fusiform cell firing at a higher baseline. Now, this will most likely go unnoticed by higher centers, like the thalamus. But if 50 fusiform cells, which are, for example, all around or all tuned around 4 kilohertz, lock their firing rhythms due to shared excitatory inhibitory loops being off balance, that collective strong signal is more likely to get through the thalamus and be perceived as an actual sound, or tinnitus. And as we all know, hypersynchrony can occur due to the prevalence of the cofactors that I mentioned before. I mean, different cofactors like somatosensory influence due to the SP5 pathway inputting into the dorsal cochlear nucleus. Different mechanisms like, for example, inflammation and whatnot. So hypersynchrony can worsen due to these cofactors. Now let's move on to a very complex but interesting mechanism of the brain, which I mentioned to be Bayesian predictive coding. Now, the core principle of predictive coding suggests that the brain constantly makes predictions or priors about incoming sensory information and compares these to actual signals it receives, or likelihoods. And when there is a mismatch or a prediction error, the brain can either update its internal models to better fit reality or reinterpret the incoming signals. Now, in auditory terms, the brain might have a strong prior that silence is the default. If the dorsal cochlear nucleus becomes hypersynchronized or hyperactive and sends phantom signals upwards, those signals will clash with the silence prediction. And whether the brain updates to there is a sound or discards the noise as unimportant depends on how credible it interprets those signals to be. Now, if lateral inhibition is severely compromised and fusiform cells in the dorsal cochlear nucleus are not only hyperactive, but also hypersynchronized or firing in synchrony, the resulting signal is stronger and more coherent. And because the signal is robust, the top-down system may assign it as a high precision or to be reliable. And the result is, or the outcome is, that the brain's prior belief in silence is overridden, so to speak, effectively labeling the DCN's spontaneous activity as legitimate auditory events, or tinnitus. Now, in some individuals, the DCN still generates extra noise, but either it's weaker or the person's top-down filtering or prior for silence remains strong or robust, preventing the phantom signal from reaching the auditory cortex. Now let's talk a little bit more about the medial geniculate body. Now the MGB within the thalamus is a major relay station between lower auditory centers like the inferior colliculus and the auditory cortex. However, it also has a very significant filtering mechanism, also known as thalamic gating. So, for example, it can amplify or dampen signals. depending on internal states, attention, stress, or even some, neurochemical balances, the medial geniculate body can either boost or reduce incoming signals. And if we're talking about the interactions with top-down inputs, fibers from the auditory cortex project back onto the medial geniculate body, which can be seen in my previous video on feedback loops. So the fibers that project back to the MGB, they provide context. And if the cortex deems a certain frequency range or acoustic feature as important, or if stress and inflammation heightens the vigilance, the medial geniculate body passes more of that signal onwards. Now let's take a look at a more complex scenario. So if the DCN fusiform cells are hyperactive in specific frequency bands, so let's say around 4 kilohertz, that signal ascends towards the medial geniculate body. And when it arrives, 2 scenarios can happen. Scenario A is the MGB for various reasons, either high stress, inflammation, maladaptive plasticity in thalamic cortical circuits, which can happen due to drug use, fails to suppress the noise, and the phantom 4 kilohertz tone passes through to the cortex, which solidifies the tinnitus perception. And scenario B is if the MGB effectively recognizes the aberrant DCN signal as unimportant or quote-unquote chatter and blocks it, and the tinnitus remains below the threshold of conscious awareness. This actually explains why not everybody with similar degrees of cochlear damage perceive their tinnitus. Some people have better gating mechanisms or stronger top-down prior for silence. So the degree of hearing loss does not dictate the severity of tinnitus. Now a little bit about the Susan-Shore device. So the Susan-Shore device is a hypersynchrony buster, as was mentioned by one prominent figure in the tinnitus community, and I really like that. Nickname. So the hypersynchrony decreases with the Susan-Shore device usage, and that means that the organized or synchronous firing or hyperactivity of multiple clusters of fusiform cells stops due to the decrease in hypersynchrony, which means that the thalamus can stop interpreting this hyperactivity as important noise and filter it properly. Now, a little update about my Susan-Shore device usage. So I was on vacation or on break for the past 2 weeks, and I haven't used the device yet, so I will continue experimentation. But a couple of things are important to note. So the first thing is that on my break, I went skiing, and I'm a very proficient skier, and I ski very fast, and I decided to go skiing without earplugs. So that basically means that the wind noise, which can be upwards of 100 decibels, was constantly barraging my auditory system throughout this whole time, and I was skiing multiple hours a day for about maybe a week. And this was very risky for me to do, but I thought that it was worth testing out my resilience to noise. And in this scenario, my tinnitus did not spike. Actually, it did not spike at all, and neither did my hyperacusis. So the hyperacusis decrease and the tinnitus decrease. My tinnitus, as you all know, became kind of a more uniform hiss rather than multiple tones and whatnot. So my resilience to noise has definitely stayed. And if I would have done this maybe 2 or 3 months ago before the Susan-Shore device usage, I would have definitely spiked from this. So in general, Different mechanisms can be involved, but I can definitely say that the effects that I received specifically on my tinnitus and hyperacusis of the Susan Shore device usage have actually persisted, which means, and actually right now, I do not take my earplugs and earmuffs with me when I go to the store, for example, or anything like that. I still take my earplugs or earmuffs if I know someplace might be loud, but I very rarely actually have to put in my earplugs or earmuffs anymore. I can walk next to a highway without much issue. And if there's like a siren or like a very loud vehicle passing by, I can just plug my ears up with my fingers, and basically that's it. So the Susan Shore device that I built has definitely, without question, improved my resilience to noise. But we will see further if the tinnitus will disappear completely, which I will be experimenting with further usage. And my trials are about to start actually very soon, so we have quite a lot of people who will be receiving these devices from me. Many different phenotypes. So, for example, people with visual snow syndrome, people with dysacusis, people with noxacusis. So we're going to have a lot of very good data soon that I will be uploading to my YouTube channel. As usual, if you want to participate in scientific discussions, you can join the Discord server link in the description or in the pinned comments. And that's everything I wanted to say today, so more juicy videos coming soon. I'm still working on that VSS video. Very, very complex stuff, but I will, of course, release it eventually. Yep, that's about it. See ya.